this brilliant man, and I'm proud to call him a friend, who came in from DC to speak with us today. As I pull up his PowerPoint and multitask, which everyone thinks they're good at, but no one is. Michael Correia. Michael Correia is the Director of Government Relations for the National Cannabis Industry Association. His focus is raising awareness and building support for the cannabis industry's issues on Capitol Hill. In addition, Michael works with other national organizations to increase the cannabis industry profile nationally. Prior to joining NCIA, Michael spent many years working on Capitol Hill, including work for Representative George Rodanovich, Republican, California, who retired in 2010 in the House Committee on Resources, serving 3 different chairmen. Previously, he was Director of Federal Affairs for the American Legislative Exchange Council and Senior Project Management for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. In both positions, he advocated for policies in Congress. A campaign veteran, it's true, he has worked and volunteered on numerous political campaigns at the local, state, and federal levels over the past 2 decades. Michael is a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, a native of San Diego, and he resides in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Michael Correia.
Thank you, Green Goods. Thanks for the opportunity to come out here. And thanks for the intro. I don't think I need to explain my background, but I was the first cannabis industry lobbyist in DC. I started in 2013, before there were legal sales in Washington State and Colorado. Those happened in 2014. The world was a lot different in 2013 on Capitol Hill. You represent who? You represent what? What do you want? And I've had senators physically back away from handshakes, back in the day, to where now, fast forward, we have the Senate Majority Leader introducing his own cannabis legalization bill. You've had the House of Representatives pass legalization bills multiple occasions, and you've seen sort of the maturity of the industry, and so how things have changed over these past 8 or 9 years. I've been talking to a lot of you guys at the breaks, and you guys are talking to your patients on individual levels. I wanted to sort of pull it back and do like a 30,000 foot level, political level of what's going on, the issue. I'll do a little History 101. You gave a little History 101. And so I'll repeat a couple points, talk about just the issue, overall in Middle America, and then how that affects legalization, and tie it into what's happening in DC, and why after 9 years we haven't gotten something over the finish line. As Paloma mentioned, I work for NCIA. We're a trade association, just like the Chamber of Commerce. We have 1,000 plus businesses. We represent the cannabis industry issues. This is a picture pre-COVID where our members, we descend on Capitol Hill. We get about 300 or 400 of our members. We do meetings across the House and Senate, do fundraisers, do receptions, do briefings. We do everything. We haven't been able to do that because the Capitol's been closed for 2 years. We're hoping that one of these days, maybe next Congress, they'll open it up. We can get back. Maybe many of you people who are interested either want to be part of NCIA or just be a lobbyist and get out there and advocate. It's really important. That's one of the things as a lobbyist, COVID has really messed me up, is trying to be a lobbyist, interacting with people with the Capitol closed, not doing in-person meetings where fundraisers are Zoom meetings. It's like, why am I going to pay $1,000 to see you on a camera when I can see you in person? And so it's really affected my life as lobbying. The industry as a whole cares about the banking issue. There's a provision in the tax code called 280E where if you're touching the plant, you get penalized a prohibitive tax for plant touching businesses that we're trying to address. There's always the fear of federal enforcement, whatever's happening at the state level. Technically, this is illegal at the federal level. Federal people can come in, arrest you. People are still getting arrested. Diversity and inclusion. The war on drugs has penalized minority communities. That is something, the last thing we want is 50 years of being penalized. Now the market's starting to open up, and those communities who were most hurt are going to get left behind. So diversity and inclusion is a big part of it. And then regulations. As you're seeing at the state level, how you do regulations are very important on the outcome of what you're looking for. We are probably the only industry going to Capitol Hill saying, please regulate us. Most industries out there are saying, cut regulations, cut taxes, cut everything. We actually want a good tax structure. We want a good regulatory structure because I think it's one way we roll out legalization. Paloma, in her little speech, mentioned the Controlled Substances Act. And why is it important? It's a Schedule I drug. And as she mentioned, it basically says it has no currently accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, along with heroin, LSD, ecstasy, whereas cocaine, meth, and oxy are Schedule II. So the federal government views cannabis as more dangerous than these other drugs. That's just that mindset. And that's been instilled in us for 50, 60 plus years of why it's so dangerous. And it's going to take a long time. I was talking to a gentleman at lunch, just unwinding that 50 years of that we've been brainwashed that everything is just a gateway drug. Marijuana is going to lead to this. And that's something you think about. Because of that scheduling, it affects everything. DOJ, DEA can interact, can get involved with everything. It limits research. It limits banking investment. It limits interstate commerce. You can't own a firearm. You lose federal benefits. Veterans can't talk to their doctors about this. You lose benefits on any, maybe it's student loan or other benefits, let alone the fact that you use this as a means to arrest hundreds of thousands of people, mostly minorities, for this. At the same time, the federal government has a patent and the FDA has allowed Epidiolex, where they're showing there's medical benefit. The left hand and right hand are on the mix. And that's what's going on. I tie it in because it's all tied into politics and why politics hasn't changed. Now this, I want to use this quote. This was taken off the American Medical Association's website. This was Susan Bailey, the past president of the AMA. The science about the benefits of cannabis is limited, while the available evidence demonstrates that legalizing the adult use of cannabis poses a threat to public health. Our AMA does not support legalization of cannabis for adult use until additional scientific research has been completed to fully document the public health, medical, and economic consequences of its use. We remain particularly concerned about cannabis use by young people as well as pregnant or breastfeeding women, and continue to call for robust public health messaging and deleterious health effects on cannabis. Why is that important? If you look at what she says, if you break down her quote, the science about the benefits of cannabis is limited. And I don't know if you guys know this, for federal funding on research on cannabis, you need to get a permit from the DEA. And the DEA rarely, if ever, gives permits for benefits of cannabis. They easily will give permits if you want to study the effects on the bad effects on cannabis, especially on teenagers or mothers or what have you, no problem. It's wonderful logic. It creates this circular. A policy person can sit here and say there's not enough science and evidence and research to show cannabis is safe, but they limited the research and they've skewed the data to where the only outcome you get is bad science. So someone like a medical profession, past profession, a scientist, who believes in trying to find solutions, the president of the AMA, she's not lying. She's just sort of misguided and misinformed on ways she's making it, versus the AMA would love to study cannabis. And we are doing things to find more research, and people like the AMA should be pushing NIDA and the FDA and other groups. We want to study more, and that's really important. Next up, I wanted to talk about sort of the politics of cannabis, where we're at currently right now, and it's always changing. There's about 18 states with a legal adult use where adults can purchase cannabis. There are about 36 states with some working medical marijuana programs. And then there are a handful of states with limited use. It's usually CBD. It's very limited on how you use it. I think there are 2 states in the union. I think it's Nebraska and Idaho, or Kansas and Idaho, where they have no changes on their cannabis laws. So technically, there's 48 states that have cannabis laws that come in conflict with the federal government, which in itself is amazing. I joke that 49 states will legalize cannabis for adult use before the federal government ever gets around to it. So one of these things, I've been doing this for 9 years, and every time we have a couple states legalize, and when California went legalized and others, and now it's going to be New York and New Jersey and New England, everyone talks about tipping point. What's the tipping point to get there? Where now a majority of people live in states where cannabis is legal or have access to that. But it still hasn't changed. Demographic groups. Right now, this was, I think, from 2021, where it's 60% of the population believes that cannabis should be legalized. When I started 9 years ago, it was about 50%, right on there. So it's increased 10%. About 30% believe only medical. What's that mean? It means 90% of the population thinks that this shouldn't be illegal and that the federal government should stop making it illegal and we should go forward and have people should be able to have access to it. You look at demographic groups, age groups across the board are supportive of this, a majority. 75 and older, it's a very slim majority or almost a minority. Because those beliefs have been in their heads for 25 years. My parents' generation, it's those group. I grew up in the Just Say No 80s. Cannabis was horrible. And I don't have to unwind. I only have to unwind 40 years of that versus 50 or 60 years of that. It's ever changing. I think one of the biggest changes on public opinion has been the broad use of the internet. And now we can get information directly from sources. Whereas before, pre-internet, you had to go to your, the school teachers, your government officials, whatever propaganda they were peddling, that's what you had. And now any 16-year-old can type in, tell me about cannabis, and they can learn. And I think that's opened people's mind and changed the public perception about cannabis in general. There's two approaches in D.C. One of them, and this is what NCIA supports, is descheduling cannabis. You deschedule cannabis, you fix the banking issue, you fix the tax issue. It's the only way to address social equity and inclusion. It takes the power away from the DEA. You can tax it and regulate it like other, and it removes it from a list of drugs like that have negative benefits. It fixes the federal-state conflict. It allows for interstate commerce. It allows for research. And the other option, and this is something that was discussed a few years ago, politicians, in 2015, 2016, we're talking about we need more research. We need more research. How do we get more research? Well, take it out of Schedule 1, put it in Schedule 2. And they realized NCI was opposed to that. We sort of tried to walk them back on that. It doesn't make it easier for research. It doesn't really change anything. It doesn't really address the issues. If you were to reschedule, it would maybe be 3, but our position has been deschedule this. There's talk, do you form a new schedule for cannabis? Somehow you create a new one where you can research, you can study it, but it is limited. And you guys all know about rescheduling drugs. You don't just reschedule drugs every year. You just don't change it and go up and down. So if they were to reschedule cannabis to Schedule 2, it would probably be there for 25 to 50 years, which defeats the purpose of all this. So when any federal policymakers talk about rescheduling, we always push back, and it's like deschedule or think of something new. The debate in Congress right now is, when I started this job 9 years ago, my logic and strategy was, I'm going to go to Congress and talk about incremental bills, the banking bill, the tax bill. Congress can pass these, and it allowed state legal businesses to operate legally and to function. And then we could spend the years it took to legalize cannabis at the federal level. Here, 9 years later, we've gotten nothing incrementally. And now the discussion is, especially among Democrats, is incremental reform does not go far enough. And comprehensive reform, descheduling cannabis, stop getting people arrested, research, is the only way to address the issue. I'm in total agreement. The problem is the votes. The votes are not there. And to legalize cannabis and to pass anything on that big a level, you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate. And to think that 60 senators can agree on anything in D.C., let alone legalization, it's not there. And one of the biggest issue that we're dealing with is you have incremental reform. To me, my logic is incremental reform will lead to comprehensive reform. It builds up momentum and will finally get to over the finish line. Whereas comprehensive reform, the votes aren't there. Anyone can, guess that it's not going to be a good November for Democrats. There's a chance if Republicans take over, cannabis reform is dead. And so there's thinking that between now and November, maybe common sense will enlighten some of these Senate leaders, and they will allow incremental reform to happen. It's something we're hoping for and something we're pushing for. There are various legislative bills out there that deal with incremental and comprehensive reform. The bill that we most care about, we named it, it's something that's really important to us, the Safe Banking Act. It allows, what does it do? It basically, it allows the banks to deal with the cannabis industry without fear of federal interference and federal prosecution and anti-money laws and other things. Is it an end-all be-all? Does it solve the problem? No. But it gives just a little more certainty for state legal businesses to get finance and to get access to capital, which would lower the cost and would help small businesses and help minority businesses along the way. The Safe Banking Act has now passed the House of Representatives in different iterations 6 different times. It first passed the House, the proudest moment of my career in 2019. We had 321 votes. We had 90 plus Republicans. It was truly a bipartisan bill. In the Senate, the Safe Banking Act has 42 co-sponsors, 9 Republicans. I've been in politics my whole life. You can't get Republicans and Democrats to agree on anything. Puppies, legalize puppies, and they won't do it. They won't agree on it because they'll just take a position. Republicans will say, you want this, I don't want it. The fact that we have 9 Republicans supporting this and 90 in the House, and the fact that this has passed the House 6 times, it's teed up, it's ready to go. Why is it not going over the finish line? And the issue is not because of pot prohibitionists, it's not because of Mitch McConnell stopping anything, it's because Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York, doesn't think it goes far enough and doesn't think it addresses the issue. And Cory Booker is another person who's had the same position. We've talked to them, and Cory Booker said to me, he doesn't want his college frat boy bros on Wall Street getting rich on this. And so they've made this out to where it's just going to be rich bankers getting rich versus helping the industry. It's a position that I think it's hurting small businesses, it's hurting minority businesses, it's keeping the cost of capital up, and it's just leading eventually to consolidation in the market. And you're seeing bigger companies buy up other companies. Chuck Schumer has his own legalization bill, the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. He first mentioned this in February of 2021. They dropped their discussion draft in July of 2021. They asked for public comments. NCIA gave 41 pages of public comments of what we thought was good in the bill and bad in the bill. The plan was to take those comments, adjust the legislation, and then reintroduce the bill. They've been delayed because a lot of the Senate staff were busy focusing on Build Back Better, and which never happened. They've been delayed a few months. The thinking is the bill is going to get introduced this April. Everyone thinks between, right around 4/20 to publicize it. Here's the problem. They've talked about this bill for 15 months. It still hasn't seen the light of day. They're going to drop a bill in April, and then they think that legalization is going to happen between April and November. It's not going to happen. This has been a very... Chuck Schumer just came out the other day and said he wanted Republicans' input on this, but they've made this such a partisan bill, no Republican in their life would ever get on a Chuck Schumer bill. So we look at the number 60. They're going to have Chuck Schumer, they're going to have Cory Booker, they're going to have Ron Wyden on the bill. Great, you have 3. Where are the other 57? And so that's the math that we're dealing with. So they put all their effort. They feel like all the oxygen will get sucked out of the reform movement if they pass banking. They want this to be the discussion point. They will probably introduce it this month. They talk about having hearings. They will have hearings on the bill in the next month or two, publicize the issue. Our hope and our prayers is that they see the reality that the votes aren't there, have your time of day, and then pivot and pass something like SAFE. What are some other bills? The MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. It is the a legalization bill that was introduced by Jerry Nadler from New York. He's the chair of the Judiciary Committee. It was introduced in 2019. It passed by a slim majority in the lame duck session last December of 2020, right before Congress got out the door. The vote was 228 to 164. They only had 5 or 6 Republicans on it, and 5 or 6 Democrats voted opposed to it. It barely passed with a small majority. They've made very little changes to it. We had some issues with it. Our biggest issue is there's no regulatory component. You know, I like to use the analogy of the dog chasing the car. He caught the car, now what? Okay, you passed legalization. There's no regulations, now what? The FDA and government bureaucracies will slow play this for years, and there'll just be a lot of uncertainty when it comes to a lot of things. So any legalization bill needs a very robust regulatory structure that I'll be talking about later on. Last week, it came back out. It passed the House 220 to 204. It's lost votes. It actually lost, 40 more people voted against it. So, you know, cannabis reform has been going on this trajectory up. And when they've taken they tried to make this a partisan issue. Dave Joyce is a Republican from Ohio. He is the Republican co-chair of the Cannabis Caucus, our friend. He's great for the movement. He worked with the office and said, let's work on this bill to try to make it more bipartisan. And they said no. And he actually worked and he tried to oppose it. Why am I saying this? It's barely passing. It's not bipartisan. The bill's dead on arrival in the Senate. It's political theater. And I hate to say this, the Democratic Party has tried to take this issue and just campaign on it. They're not trying to solve a problem. They're not trying to address the cannabis issue. They're not trying to say, where are the votes? Let's get something over the finish line. If they were, they would work on something bipartisan to get it over the finish line. That's what's going on. It's comprehensive reform. It's a MORE Act. It basically, it legalizes, allows the states to legalize. It allows up to 50 of the states to legalize. It deals with expungement. It deals with a lot of things. It's a really good bill, except it's missing a regulatory component. And that's one of the reasons why we are supportive of the concept, supportive of the issue. We're not opposed to it, but we think it could be better, and we need to work on something like that to be better. There are other bills in Congress right now. There's a couple. There's expungement bills. There's the HOPE Act, which Congressman Joyce, the Republican, with AOC, a liberal Democrat from New York, got together. These are bills, something like this, the HOPE Act, would probably have very bipartisan support. And so it's not what I want. It's not what cannabis wants. It's what Congress is going to give us. What are 218 votes? What are 60 senators? And what's the president going to sign? That's the reality I try to deal with. So something like that has a lot of support. The States Reform Act was Nancy Mace. She's a freshman Republican from South Carolina. And she, I learned a little history about her. She's pretty amazing. She was the first woman at the Citadel years ago. And she had some trauma in her life, some assault, and she used cannabis to sort of recover and deal with that. So she's a supporter of this. This is one of her 3 issues that she wants to accomplish in Congress. She's from South Carolina, not a legal state. Her own party is opposed to this. And there's a very tough primary that she's going through. And I try to talk about the realities of politics associated with this. Democrats are broadly in support of this. Republicans are sort of supportive of it. They tend to be the libertarian wing of the party, who are the ones who are the craziest ones, the insurrectionists. It's really hard to build a campaign around people that want to sort of overthrow our government. It's tough for me as a lobbyist to be seen with these people. Nancy Mace isn't one of these people, but she has a very tough primary. There's a chance she could lose her primary. And there's a chance, this is not a winning issue in the district, but it's very important. Those are some of the political dynamics we're dealing with. There's just other bills out there that have some support. A lot of the issues people talk about is research. There's 5 minutes. So I just want to say, Paloma was nice enough to put me right after lunch. and when everyone's tired. But normally at cannabis conferences, we call it cannabis time. Everything runs a half an hour late, and you guys are running on time, so I want to make sure I go over, and just to make sure we get on cannabis time a little bit. So you just can't be on time with everything. So I mentioned regulatory. So in 2019. We did a white paper called Adapting a Regulatory Framework for the Emerging Cannabis Industry. We did a briefing on Capitol Hill, which is where I met Paloma. This is the first time I met you years ago. It's been wonderful. We as an industry, we want regulations, and we looked at it as sort of 4 buckets of where the regulation should be. If it's a pharmaceutical, where should it be regulated? If it's THC product, if you're using lotions, if it's an agricultural commodity, it's low THC, ingestible products, topical. There were different lanes of who we thought the regulatory bodies should be, how the taxation should be. As a person who's been in DC a long time, if Congress doesn't specifically say what regulations should be, the regulatory agencies, they go on forever. In 2018, the Farm Bill legalized hemp but there were no regulatory structures around America or around that. It was up to each individual state to do their own hemp regulations. I don't know how many people have heard of Delta 8. You guys heard of Delta 8? That's sort of where the science is in front of the regulations. And the hemp manufacturers produce all this hemp product. They didn't know what to do with it. And they're like, hey, let's have some fun. And all of a sudden, someone came up on Delta 8 and they had a new product. Whereas I don't think middle America knows about this. The fact that you can buy these products and possibly get high, the fact that you get them at gas stations, where you think, oh, it's just hemp. It's just, it's oils, it's cotton fiber, it's industrial hemp. And now people are getting high from this. This is an unintended consequence of not having regulations and why we want good regulations and why it's really important. I mentioned the war on drugs, of how it's hurt people of color. The diversity, inclusion, and equity is a very big part of that. The Democratic Party, that's one of the big drivers of their legalization. They want to address this. And hate to get political, but that's what I do. Chuck Schumer is the majority leader of the Senate, but he also has a primary possibility in New York, and he's worried about getting primaried by his progressive side. So he's taken positions on cannabis that are very woke and very to the progressive side, but not realistic based. So they produce a bill like his bill that has no shot of going anywhere, but is a good political football that he wants to deal with. And so I think he would much rather campaign on the cannabis issue than actually solve the cannabis policy issue. That's important. NCIA has a social equity scholarship program that we work to help communities. It's really important. So why is cannabis not legal at the federal level? And it's just one of these things. I've always had a thought that Congress lags public opinion by 5 to 10 years. I'm going to have to pull that back by about 10 years. When I started this, I thought this would be an 8 to 10 year process for legalization. I'm in year 9. I was totally off. And so we're not there. When I talk to a lot of you guys in the different states, there's this public perception. And when I talked about the AMA and Schedule 2 and 50 years of brainwashing, when they were debating the MORE Act last week, a lot of the Republicans were coming up, and it's just they use these same tired arguments. It's a gateway drug. It's a gateway drug. You talk to politicians. Why would I legalize cannabis? We have an opioid epidemic in our state. And it's one of these issues, and there's the science, and any scientist can give you evidence of why cannabis will help opioids. The politician who has to go out in front of moms and parents and everything saying, legalize cannabis, it'll help opioids, it's sometimes very hard to make that connection. And I want to sort of end on a couple of humorous notes. 2018, a study was done to where they said basically physicians, doctors were trusted more when they had their white coats on. And so why do I say this? You guys are very important. The doctors are very important. When the AMA is opposed to something like this, it's hard for middle America to get around something like this. If middle America is not going to totally embrace it, Congress won't embrace it. And if politicians can still talk about the slippery slope, it's just enough doubt to put into a senator's head of why they shouldn't do something like this. So you guys are very important for educating your friends, educating your patients, educating the public, doing press, being enlightened on this issue. The fact that you're here at a cannabis conference says you're enlightened on this issue and wanting to learn more. It's really important because when there's doubt, politicians are going to point to you guys, and they're going to point to doctors and the AMA, and they're going to say, this is not good science. And then you guys are going to need to raise your hand and say why we need better science and what we need to do, why we need to get the DEA out of this, why we need more research and studying, and let the science, let this become a policy issue and not a political issue. And it's really important. NCIA is there. We normally do, and you going to give me 1 minute? You're going to start playing music and walk me off or something like that? You just be like this. And yeah, no, you're not going to come up and slap me. And then here's contact information. You know, I want to be a resource. I want you guys to understand life as a politician and why decisions are made or not made in DC, what I'm dealing with in DC, and why something hasn't gotten over the finish line. And with that, I'll take questions or sit down.
We can do a couple